Richard Nixon's presidency is one of the most misunderstood time periods in American history. So today we're going to try to understand it together. So after losing the presidential election of 1960 to John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon ran again and won the election of 1968. That's pretty rare to be able to come back and win an election 8 years after you lost an election. Now, he immediately started working on U.S. foreign policy, and his biggest goal was to build a lasting structure of peace. Peace was something that was always on his mind. He was a Quaker, his mother was a Quaker, and they were very much concerned with how to spread peace around the world. Now, immediately when he came into office, remember, the U.S. was mired in the Vietnam War, and during the years of Lyndon Johnson, our involvement in the Vietnam War had increased steadily every year. Casualties had gone up every year. Then when Richard Nixon became president in 1969, everything started to shift. Everything reversed to where, yes, we did remain in Vietnam another 4 years, but every year we had fewer and fewer people there and fewer casualties. So he started to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam slowly but steadily. The reason he did this slowly but steadily instead of all right away was because he believed that if we removed them all right away, then South Vietnam would collapse, North Vietnam would take over, communism would spread, and then all of the American lives lost over there would have been for nothing. So his plan, called Vietnamization, was to gradually hand over the war to the South Vietnamese and to end U.S. involvement in a number of years. So Nixon said, yes, we need peace there, but we need peace with honor. We can't have peace at the expense of a violent regime taking over and oppressing millions of people. We need peace with honor. So peace talks began with the North Vietnamese when Nixon took office, and the person he usually sent to negotiate with them was a brilliant man named Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger was a German Jewish immigrant who served as Nixon's national security advisor in his first term and later as his Secretary of State in his second term. Now, he's seen as one of the most effective presidential advisors in history because he was able to negotiate so well with foreign adversaries. So after several years of this process of Vietnamization, deaths are going down, the war is ramping down, and it looks like the end is near. So in 1972, the U.S. and North Vietnam were very close to a peace agreement, but at the last second, North Vietnam backed out of it. So, after winning re-election in 1972, President Nixon decided to force them back to the peace table again. He ordered Operation Linebacker 2, better known as the Christmas bombings, from December 18th to 29th of 1972. Now, this was the largest heavy bomber strike launched by the U.S. since World War II. After this 12-day bombing campaign, North Vietnamese leaders literally thought that Nixon was a madman. They knew he didn't have to run for re-election again and therefore believed that in his mind he had nothing to lose and would stop at nothing to end the war. And this convinced them to come back and negotiate for peace with the U.S. Now, this is something very similar to what Eisenhower did at the end of the Korean War to get the North Koreans and the Chinese to negotiate for peace. There were rumors that he was willing to drop an atomic bomb, and while that wasn't true, he let them think that to bring a war to an end. Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and here you see him taking a page from his former boss's book and doing the same thing in order to gain peace in Vietnam. So this convinced the North Vietnamese to come back and negotiate for peace with the U.S., and this resulted in the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. This was a ceasefire. Negotiated by Henry Kissinger, this ended the fighting in Vietnam. Now, this was very similar to the ceasefire that Eisenhower had negotiated in Korea in July of 1953. So this released all U.S. prisoners of war, which was a quite considerable number at this time, over 1,000, and it gave the U.S. 60 days to leave Vietnam. Afterwards, the country was once again divided at the 17th parallel, like it had been before North Vietnam had invaded South Vietnam in the 1960s, with communism contained to North Vietnam and South Vietnam remaining free. So this was seen as a victory because communism had been contained. However, shortly after the ceasefire was agreed upon, and the United States left Vietnam, the North Vietnamese immediately broke the agreement. They violated the Paris Peace Accords and started fighting again. They invaded the South again, and then over the next 2 years, captured one village at a time until only the capital city of Saigon remained free. Now, the U.S. had suspected that the North Vietnamese would pull something like this. We didn't trust them, and we realized that once we left, it was possible that they would start fighting again and try to take over South Vietnam now that our presence was no longer there. And this is why, in the Paris Peace Accords, the U.S. promised to send military aid to South Vietnam if the North Vietnamese violated the accords. So, with North Vietnamese troops surrounding Saigon in April of 1975, it was clear that the South Vietnamese troops could no longer resist them without American aid. So the U.S. president, who at this point was Gerald Ford, because Nixon had to resign in 1974, we'll get more to that in a minute, but at this point, Nixon's not in office anymore. He was the one who the Paris Peace Accords had been negotiated under 2 years before. And at this point, Gerald Ford goes to Congress and asks them to approve the sending of aid to help the South Vietnamese in accordance with the promise in the Paris Peace Accords. He said, okay, it's time to honor the promise we made in the Paris Peace Accords. But Congress actually refused. They refused to make good on our promise. They said, hey, that promise was made when Nixon was president. We hate that guy. He's not even president anymore. Why should we honor that? We're not going to send more American boys over there to die. Therefore, Saigon fell. Since there was no American aid that was sent to help them, on April 30th, 1975, Saigon was taken by the communists. The war was then lost, and South Vietnam had fallen to communism. After this point, the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia then became communist as well. This proved the so-called domino theory correct, the theory that said if one nation falls to communism, very quickly bordering nations in the region would fall to communism as well. So this war that seemed like it had been a ceasefire, seemed that it had been a hard-won success, turned out to be a loss because the North Vietnamese violated the peace treaty, and then the U.S. Congress refused to honor our part of the treaty by sending aid to help the South Vietnamese. Now, once Laos and Cambodia became communist, along with South Vietnam, Cambodia in particular fell to a murderous regime called the Khmer Rouge, led by a guy named Pol Pot, an evil dictator, and they carried out a genocide against those who resisted their communist takeover. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, killed 2 million people, which was 1/3 of the Cambodian population. Laos and Vietnam are still communist to this day. Well, what else was happening during Nixon's time in the White House? Well, Nixon's presidency was during the middle of the Cold War, and in addition to anti-communist efforts in Vietnam, Nixon also directed his focus toward Communist China, or Red China as it was called at the time. Now, since its fall to communism in 1949, China had been completely closed off to the rest of the world regarding trade and foreign influence. There were only a couple of nations they were allies with, for example, North Vietnam and North Korea, because they too were communist and bordered them. But they certainly had no trade with the West or influence from Western nations. Nixon said that this was not a good thing. He said that this is trapping hundreds of millions of people in poverty and communist oppression. And he also said it's bad for the global economy. It's bad for the global society because 800 million people in China are not contributing to the global market, and they could be a big force for good. So finally, in February of 1972, Nixon managed a visit to China. He became the first president to visit Red China, and he met with Mao Zedong. He toured around the country, and he insisted that a camera crew follow him to capture the whole trip on film. And this was a brilliant move because through this diplomacy, Nixon was able to convince Mao Zedong to open China and to start loosening his communist grip on his nation. Nixon was able to speak with him as an equal, and in that way show him that it would be in China's national interest to start trading with the rest of the world. This reduced Cold War tensions because this is a communist nation now no longer being a fierce enemy of the U.S. And it also showed the Soviet Union that the U.S. was willing to seek peace with the communist world. So in one way, it kind of played one communist power off of another and showed the Soviet Union that China is not going to be just your ally, they're going to be our ally as well. Now, after Mao's death 4 years later in 1976, China transitioned to a free market economy, and this lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Now, sadly, China's communist social system remains a force to this day. Nixon developed and promoted a foreign policy measure called détente when it came to the Soviet Union. In fact, just 3 months after his visit to communist China, he visited the Soviet Union to meet with their leader, Leonid Brezhnev. And his policy of détente essentially means a relaxation of tensions. He said that since the Cuban Missile Crisis, especially, which had happened 10 years prior, relations with the Soviet Union have been very tense, have been very harsh and not friendly and dangerous, frankly. And the threat for nuclear war remained. So Nixon met with Brezhnev, once again as equals, as he was so good at doing, and said, how can we reduce the risk of nuclear war? How can our two countries grow closer to where the threat of the Cold War is no longer so imminent? So détente led to the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. And in this, Nixon and Brezhnev agreed to reduce their number of nuclear warheads. This would lessen the threat of nuclear war, and it would also lessen the potential destruction of a nuclear war should one occur. And this worked very well, stabilized America's relationship with the Soviet Union for years. Well, during his presidency, Nixon did not just go to Vietnam and China and Russia. He went all over the world. Nixon reestablished relations with Egypt, which was key because it's an oil-producing country and it was the largest Arab nation in the world, so becoming friendly with Egypt again really paved the way for peace. And Nixon also became the first president to visit the nation of Israel, which had existed since Truman's presidency. He also saved Israel's life in October of 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. Israel was invaded on multiple fronts by many different nations, and the U.S. was really the only country that came to its aid. Nixon said to send Israel anything that would fly, so sent them our planes, our weapons, in order for Israel to defend itself, which it did, and this ensured the lasting existence of Israel. Now, domestically, Nixon created several helpful programs, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and this promotes conservation, it combats pollution, and it conducts research. One thing he ensured was the passage of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and he said this is the way to ensure that the planet is sustainable for future generations. Nixon also, in order to fight what he called the war on cancer, which had become one of the leading causes of death in the world by the 1970s, he established the National Cancer Institute. And this funded the creation and expansion of dozens of cancer research centers. One day, Lord willing, when a cure for cancer actually comes about, it's very likely it will come from this organization instituted by Nixon in the 1970s. He would later go on to say that that is the accomplishment he is the most proud of. Now, in 1970, the United States was a completely different nation than it had been in 1950, and specifically, I'm talking about racially. Segregation was now illegal in every state. All Jim Crow laws had been repealed, and black people were no longer legally denied any of the rights guaranteed to citizens in the Constitution, rights that they had been denied for centuries up to that point. Now, the 1950s and 1960s brought about systemic and institutional change. Then 1970 onward would see more racial progress in the form of increased representation, black achievements, many historical firsts like the first black astronaut, the first black female congressman, things like that. But residual resentment from the past, racial disparities, and individual prejudices, unfortunately, did remain. Now, Richard Nixon was a lifelong supporter of civil rights. He attended Duke Law School and then served as vice president under Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961. And during his time as vice president, he worked to ensure that minorities were not discriminated against in federal contracts. He also worked with Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. This gave the Department of Justice more power to prosecute against racial discrimination. Now, in response to these strides and efforts for civil rights on the part of Nixon, Martin Luther King wrote him and said, "Let me say how deeply grateful all people of goodwill are to you for your assiduous labor and dauntless courage in seeking to make the Civil Rights Bill a reality." And that's really who Richard Nixon was. He had flaws, of course he did, but he was very much a supporter of people who were seen as the most vulnerable in society. He wanted peace, he wanted equality, he wanted justice, and he worked for that every day of his life. Now, in 1960, Nixon had run for president against John F. Kennedy, as I said before, and he actually gained the support of prominent black leaders, such as Jackie Robinson. Martin Luther King, however, switched his allegiance from Richard Nixon to John F. Kennedy when Kennedy secured his release from jail. Now, with Martin Luther King switching to support Democrat John F. Kennedy, 68% of the black vote went with MLK, and that's a big reason why Kennedy was able to defeat Nixon. Now, in 1968, when Nixon ran for president again and won, one of his first goals was to end the military draft. The draft had been used extensively in the Vietnam War, and Nixon believed that the draft unfairly targeted the poor and targeted minorities. So he was able to successfully end the military draft in 1972, and the U.S. has not had a draft ever since. Now, while school integration law had been laid down in the Brown versus Board of Education decision way back in 1954 when Nixon was vice president and Eisenhower was president, still the federal government was not succeeding at enforcing it nationwide. There wasn't a concentrated effort to enforce the law to integrate public schools around the country, really for the next 15 years. Therefore, when Nixon took office in 1969, a full 70% of black children in the South still attended segregated schools. So Nixon said, we need to prioritize this. A law that is not enforced really is no good at all. And so he said we need to enforce the integration of public schools in the South. And after just 1 year, only 8% of black children remained in segregated schools. By the end of Nixon's presidency, every single public school in the country was integrated, with only a couple of exceptions that, through legal loopholes and corrupt judges, were able to fight integration in the courts for decades. Nixon also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1970, which nationalized the previous Voting Rights Act of 1965 to apply to northern states as well as southern states. Nixon then ended discrimination in companies and labor unions that received federal contracts, essentially said you cannot discriminate against blacks or against anybody and still receive federal funding. He then signed the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, which gave the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, more money and greater power to enforce against workplace discrimination. He also worked to expand education and economic opportunities for African Americans, and to lead this initiative, he appointed a black business leader named Robert J. Brown, who convinced Nixon to give more than $100 million in federal money to historically black colleges and universities. Nixon also doubled government assistance to black-owned businesses, and by 1974, when he left office, 2/3 of the 100 largest black businesses had been started during his time in the White House. Now, one prominent black leader who recognized Nixon's civil rights efforts and accomplishments was Sammy Davis Jr. He was one of the biggest celebrities in the country at that time. Nixon had actually invited him to the White House in 1972, and Sammy was the first black person to ever spend the night in the White House. It led to this very famous picture of Sammy giving President Nixon a big hug at one of the events that Sammy sang at and Nixon spoke at. And in 1972, Sammy Davis, who was a Democrat, campaigned for Nixon, who was a Republican. So you have people coming across the aisle here in order to support peace and equality. And this was an attempt to get more African Americans to vote for him, but nonetheless, Nixon only received about 13% of the black vote. Then in 1973, as I said, Sammy performed at the White House and had this iconic photo where he gave the president a big hug. So, at the end of Nixon's first term in 1972, after 4 years of domestic and foreign policy achievements, Nixon ran for re-election, and it was really no contest at all. He won in a huge landslide, one of the 3 biggest landslides we've ever had in a presidential election in our history. In fact, he won 49 out of 50 states. The only state he lost was Massachusetts. However, in his second term, he had this huge scandal that brought an end to his otherwise successful presidency and resulted in his resignation. And that was called the Watergate scandal. Now, Richard Nixon is one of these presidents who is almost singularly remembered for one negative thing about his presidency, and that's a big reason why I spent so much time talking about all the positive things, because it really was more complicated than that. He wasn't an evil man, he wasn't a horrible president. However, he did make one big mistake, and that became the thing that brought him down. So what was Watergate? Well, on June 17th, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking in to the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. Now, at first, this just looked like a failed burglary attempt, but then it was revealed that some of the men who were caught breaking in were connected to Nixon's re-election campaign, okay? Because here he's running for re-election. His 49 state landslide is still a few months away at this point. And it was revealed that these men were not attempting to steal anything, but instead were attempting to wiretap the building to be able to hear what the Democrats were saying, maybe hear their strategies and try to thwart them, which would be illegal. Now, while this break-in was not ordered by Nixon, nor did he even know it was happening at the time, once he found out about it, he panicked and made a lot of big mistakes. He attempted to cover up the evidence of the involvement of any of his staff when he found out about it. He lied and said that there had been an investigation, and he just kind of hoped that it would all go away. But it didn't go away. The scandal continued for 2 years. You have investigative journalists finding more and more evidence of connections to people in Nixon's cabinet, in his administration, that had ordered this break-in and then had contributed to the cover-up of all the evidence. And as more and more evidence surfaced that, in fact, illegal activity had occurred, Nixon was then ordered to release the recorded conversations from his White House tapes. So Nixon was a bit paranoid, and because of that, he set up microphones and wiretaps all over the White House so he could not only record his own conversations for recollection, but also could hear what others were saying about him in the White House. So that was certainly one of his flaws. But because he had all these tapes with recorded conversations from the Oval Office, the Supreme Court basically said, hey, if we want to know the truth about whether or not you ordered this cover-up after the truth was revealed, well, how about you hand over your tapes and we'll hear for ourselves and see if you, in fact, did commit a crime. So the recorded conversations from his White House tapes were ordered to be released so that the truth could be revealed, at which point Nixon had basically no more support in Congress. His entire presidency had been engulfed by the Watergate scandal at this point. His second term was not nearly as successful as his first term because nothing was able to get done. The American people had turned on him, Congress, the press, everyone was kind of rooting for his downfall. And with much of the country calling for Nixon's removal from office, Nixon said the best thing to do at this point would be to resign. The country has to move forward. We have to be able to focus on foreign policy and economic policy again. The country's falling apart because we're all hyper-focused on this one super divisive issue. So with threats of impeachment, Congress was threatening to impeach him, and which could have led to his conviction and removal from office anyway. So Nixon decided to avoid that. He would simply resign. So he resigned the presidency. He left office on August 9th, 1974, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took office. Now, to this day, Richard Nixon is the only U.S. president to ever resign from office. So, an otherwise successful presidency that brought peace to millions of people worldwide was brought down by one scandal and, the press and the Congress's focus on that scandal. So when Gerald Ford took office, the big question was, is Richard Nixon going to go to jail for trying to cover up this scandal? Is he just going to fade into obscurity? What's going to happen with him? And Gerald Ford had to make the decision about whether or not to pardon him. And he decided a month into his presidency to pardon Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed during the Watergate scandal.